Chapter 30. The morning the family was due to meet at the Bill Butler Park, Daniel was reading what he had already written in his book. He was ready to go. Lucido had told him the night before that the only baggage he needed to take with him was the little crate containing his book. Daniel felt sad. He wanted to go back to Davy, of course. He wanted to see his mum and dad and hug them together with his brother and sister. But most of all, he wanted to come back to Key West as soon as he could to see Billy again. He knew that 7 years would have elapsed before he would set eyes on the big guy again, but it didn't matter. Billy had become a very important person in his life, and whatever happened after he returned to 2014, Daniel would make sure he would drive down to Key West in the future. "Okay, are you ready to go?" Billy asked as he opened the door of the storeroom. "Do you need to do anything before we leave?" Daniel burst out laughing. "You know, sometimes you do sound like my mum, and no, I don't need to do anything before we leave." He looked around him at the storeroom that had now been furnished with a small desk and chair, a dresser, and nice linen on the bed. To Daniel it felt like his home away from home. "All right then, let's go," Billy said. "We might be getting there first, but that will give you time to see where your dad made his accidental landing." Daniel nodded and got up from the bed. "I'd like that," he said, following Billy out of the storeroom and to the door of the pizza shop. As they were driving through the small town, Daniel remained silent. Billy shot a couple of glances in his direction but didn't say anything either. He would miss the boy for sure, he thought. But now that he had received a letter from his son inviting him to visit, there were more reasons than ever to move on with his life. To say that Malou, Gabby and Stefano were nervous about meeting everyone at the clearing would have been inaccurate. They were absolutely ecstatic. Gabby took nearly an hour to do her hair and makeup. Stefano tried gathering the old magazines he had saved from years gone by and packing them in his knapsack, while Malou made sure she looked her best for her husband. As for Damianos, he had returned to being the old shepherd the family now knew so well. "If everyone is ready, we shall go then," Damianos declared when they were all assembled on the top deck of the old cruiser. He snapped his fingers and the family soon found themselves in the middle of the Bill Butler Park's clearing. Dan, Gustavo and the Dreammaker arrived soon afterward. The moment Malou saw Dan, she practically ran to him and nestled in his arms. "Goodness, it's good to see you," she said, squeezing him tightly around the waist. "I missed you, sweetheart," Dan whispered in her ear as Stefano and Gabby joined them for a group hug. Freeing himself from his family's embrace, Dan turned to Damianos. "Thank you for bringing them back," he said, extending a hand for Damianos to shake. "It was my duty and a pleasure, Dan," the shepherd replied, shaking the stretched-out hand. "What about Daniel? Isn't he coming here?" "Yes, Dan, he'll be here in a moment, I suspect," Damianos answered. "But perhaps, and in the meantime, Gustavo and Chippewa could meet the family," turning to the two men. Yes, of course," Dan replied. "Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude, but I'm impatient as ever to see Daniel." "We all are," Malou said, nodding, and then turning to Gustavo, she added, "I'm glad to finally meet the man who took my son to the battlefront. I don't think we'll ever forget what you did for my son and for my husband. Thank you." "Not at all, Mrs. Politano," Gustavo said, a little embarrassed. "I couldn't have done any of it without Chippewa and Damianos, actually." It was Gustavo's turn to look around the clearing. "Where's Nicholas? Shouldn't he be here too?" "You called?" Nicholas replied, walking toward the group. Gustavo guffed. "Oh, there you are, you old Saint Nick. How are you?" "Excellent, Gustavo, thank you," the messenger replied as he turned his attention to Dan and the family. "I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance at long last, Mrs. Politano." Saying this, Nicholas bowed a little and then fixed his gaze on Stefano and Gabby. "The same goes for you two. I'm sure glad to see you. Your father has missed you, and you should be proud of him. He's an excellent man." "Thank you, sir," Stefano and Gabby replied in unison. Unobtrusively, Chippewa then approached the family. "Mrs. Politano, if I may." He bowed respectfully. "Your husband had an opportunity to alter his future some time ago and follow a dream, but knowing how important it was to return to all things the way they were, he focused all of his energy on coming back to you while searching for Daniel. Never forget, my dear, we will be all watching over your family." "Thank you, Chippewa. I appreciate that," Malou answered under Dan's smiling gaze. "I think it is now time for Daniel and his companion to appear," Damianos said, turning to the entrance of the clearing. "I told you it was going to be around the next corner," everyone heard Daniel say as he and Billy came along the path. Exploding in nervous laughter, Gabby was the first to rush to her brother and give him a big hug. "I thought you had drowned, you know that, you idiot." Okay, sis, it's good to see you too," Daniel said, lifting his gaze to his mum and dad as they were coming to join him. Yet Stefano was quicker. He pushed Gabby out of the way and gave Daniel a quick punch in the arm. You do that again and I'll have your hide, do you hear me? Daniel nodded twice, and then both brothers started laughing. Malou couldn't help the tears that were now coursing down her cheeks. She took him in her arms. Thank God you're okay. You don't know how scared we've been. Releasing her embrace, Malou looked up at Billy. Sir, the only thing I can say is thank you. You're welcome, ma'am, Billy said, lowering his eyes. I needed a busboy for a while and your son footed the bill. He's done a lot for me too, actually. That's what we've heard, Malou added, as Dan came to stand beside her. Yes, my wife is right. We owe you a great debt, sir, Dan said, shaking the big man's hand. He then turned to Daniel and grabbed him by both shoulders. Next time you decide to go for a swim, just remember to tell someone, okay? Okay, Dad. I'm sorry for all of it. I'm sure you are, Dan added, smiling now, and wrapping an arm around his son's shoulders, he led him to face Damianos. As Daniel was approaching him, the shepherd's face turned somber. I think it's time to put your dream catcher around your neck, son, he said. Have you got it hidden in between the pages of your book? Daniel's face turned pale. He looked down at his chest and then up at his dad. Dan had switched his gaze from Damianos to Daniel. Where is your amulet, son? Suddenly realizing what was happening, Malou gasped, You lost it, didn't you? Patting his chest with the trembling hand as if the amulet was going to appear, Daniel said, I guess I did when I went for that swim. He bowed his head and shook it. I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't think about it until just now. Daniel looked up at Damianos inquiringly. What is going to happen to him? We can't leave him. He's got to return home. He looked at Chippewa, a desperate look on his face. Couldn't you weave another one for him? Chippewa shook his head. Unfortunately, no, Dan. My powers are limited, not to say nil, in that regard. Come on, people, Gabby shouted all of a sudden. Don't tell us you can't do anything about a silly amulet. She was becoming hysterical. Hush, Gabby, Malou said, taking her daughter in her arms. I'm sure we'll figure something out. She turned her attention to Damianos. What's going to happen to him if we leave him behind? She asked. He'll live his life here, Damianos replied. But he will not be able to join you in the future. You mean he'll be part of the past forever? Dan asked. Yes, Dan, unfortunately. What about if I paid $5 for a new amulet for my brother? Stefano queried, focusing his gaze on Chippewa. Everyone turned to the young man and stared before Malou erupted. Stefano, that's insulting. How could you? Let me, Mrs. Politano, Chippewa said softly, returning his attention to Stefano. The $5 you paid to the Seminole in Pahokee-san was a representative token of very ancient rules. The number 5 has great significance. As far as you should be concerned, you haven't paid $5, but promised to maintain 5 as the number of good commandments versus 5 admonitions. In fact, the number 5 can be found in the Bible on numerous occasions. The number 5 represents God's grace seen throughout the structure of the tabernacle in the wilderness. There were 5 original priests, Aaron and his 4 sons. So you see, the payment of $5 was symbolic and not to be taken as a stipend for work to be done or for the purchase of a dream catcher. It was much more than that. Stefano was dumbfounded. He didn't know what else to say except, I'm sorry, Daniel, but I just didn't know what else to do. That's okay, bro, Daniel said resignedly. I'll just have to stay here with Billy and lead my life. No, son, you will not sacrifice yourself for what has been my mistake all along. I was going back in time to redeem myself for my past trespasses. Dan, Malou tried interrupting. No, Malou, please. You see, there's another mention of the number 5 in the Bible. Now we have a further revelation of a people called out from mankind, redeemed and saved to walk with God from earth to heaven. Hence redemption follows creation. Inasmuch as in consequence of the fall of man, creation came under the curse and was made subject to vanity. Therefore man and creation must be redeemed. Thus we have the Father, the Son, the Spirit, the creation, and ultimately redemption. These are the 5 great mysteries, therefore they are the number of God's graces. If 4 is the number of the world, then it represents man's weakness and helplessness and vanity, as we have seen. My ultimate redemption is for me to surrender to God's will. He paused and looked around him. I will stay here or be sent to my perdition, and you, Malou, Stefano, Daniel, and Gabby will return to 2014. Dad, Gabby screamed, stomping her foot repeatedly on the ground like a little girl. We can't leave you here. God is all merciful. He won't let that happen, will he, Mum? Malou turned a pleading face to her husband. None of us wants to leave you, Dan. We want to stay with you. She wrapped her arms around his neck. Dan shook his head vehemently, drawing her arms away gently but firmly and holding her hands in his. No, Malou, this is not a matter of staying with me. It is a matter of my attaining redemption for what I have done. I have led my life selfishly and was made subject to vanity which has encumbered my thoughts. But, honey, We've all made mistakes in our lives. Please, Malou, don't. I need you to guide the children through their lives now. They're all grown up. They need your love and a mother to cherish. Dad, we still need you. How could you abandon us now? I'm not abandoning any of you, Stefano. I'm simply going to abide by God's will. I was a fool too many times, and now I have to go where the God Lord wants me to be. Dad, please, Gabby yelled, throwing herself in her father's arms. I won't accept this. She turned to her mother. Mum, please say something. Dad can't do this. Gently pulling her daughter away from her father, Malou said, Listen to me. Mrs. Politano, Chippewa interrupted. I'm very sorry, but I'll have to intervene here. You and Dan and your family needs to understand that there is no more time to spare. Should you linger in this state of limbo, you will not be able to return to the future at all. You will put your entire family's life in jeopardy, and you might spur the wrath of our Lord in doing so. Dan nodded. He knew what the dangers were. He took his daughter into his arms again and whispered in her ear, It is God's will. We cannot go against it, Gabby. No one can. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He took his mother by the shoulders and practically hollered, Mum, please, we can't let Dad sacrifice himself for what I have done, he argued fervidly. I am the one who should pay for my mistake, not Dad. Enough, boy, Dan shouted. I've made up my mind. This is God's will. This is what He needed me to do all along. It is the price I have to pay for my redemption. His tone of voice was adamant. Unmistakable, Dan needed to stay behind. He turned to Chippewa. Please, give my book to Daniel. The Dreammaker nodded and handed him Dan's book. Daniel took it off his hands, and looking at it, he started crying like a young boy. Dad, please. I'm sorry. While Daniel was protesting, Dan took the Dreamcatcher from around his neck and passed it over his son's head. That will keep you safe now, son. God will watch over you much better than I ever could. Trust in Him always. And if you're staying, I'm not leaving either, Gustavo declared all of a sudden. I'm vowed to accompany you wherever your travels may lead you. And right now, I've no plans to go anywhere without you, so buddy, you're stuck with me. Dan shook his head. As I said to my family, this is my redemption, Gustavo, not yours. Don't be an idiot, Dan. I'm staying, and that's my decision to make, so like it or lump it, I'm here for the duration. If God wants me to do otherwise, He'll soon let me know. A pall of sadness enveloping the family, Malou and the children hugged Dan as tightly as their sobbing heart could express and released him reluctantly a moment later. Malou turned around to look at Damianos. We are ready, she said between heart-wrenching sobs. She then took Gabby and Daniel's hands while Stefano latched onto his sister's hand. As soon as Damianos snapped his fingers, the four of them began to feel lighter, and lights began to flash back and forth, along with fog and winds blowing from different directions. Then all of a sudden, everything stopped.